hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator.
Welcome back to the next episode of BC Law's Just Law podcast. I'm Tom Blakely. I'm here with Jim Fiore and Professor Daniel Lyons to talk about the prospective TikTok ban that's being debated in Congress. Professor Lyons is a professor and the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at BC Law. He specializes in property, telecommunications, and internet law, and administrative law as well. Before joining BC Law, Lyons practiced at the firm of Munger, Tolles & Olson in Los Angeles. He also clerked for Judge Cynthia Holcomb Hall of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Lyons has testified before Congress and state legislatures and has participated in numerous proceedings at the Federal Communications Commission. His work has appeared in legal journals such as the Emory Law Journal and the popular press, including Forbes Magazine, U.S. News and World Report, and the Wall Street Journal. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he has written more than 150 blog posts on tech policy issues. Professor Lyons, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
All right, well, before we get into it here, if you'd just like to set the stage of what's going on with this TikTok ban, it seems like it's picked up steam over time. There's been a lot of headlines coming out of Washington in the last week about people having all sorts of problems with TikTok and what to do about the app, but could you just set the stage for us?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that everybody sort of identifies TikTok as a problem, but they're having a lot of trouble figuring out what the problem actually is, right? So the story of TikTok regulation begins way back in the Trump administration when toward the tail end of the administration, maybe as part of the president's larger war on big tech, maybe part of his attack on China, right? He proposed that TikTok be banned from the United States and also that TikTok's corporate parent, ByteDance, divest the company and sell it to the United States as a condition of allowing the platform to continue to operate. Those measures never got any traction, but the ideas behind them continued to sort of flourish in the zeitgeist and have come up in a big way as TikTok has grown to be right now the most downloaded social media platform in the United States. So more recently, we've seen steam build up on a more bipartisan basis for both of those moves, either a ban of the platform from American users or divestiture. But when you push hard on why that should happen, I think you get a whole lot of different results. And untangling sort of what the drivers are of that is a key part of the how the debate's going to be resolved going forward.
Yeah, and so I feel like many people think of TikTok as, you know, with videos, short form videos of like dances and other memes and obviously expanded to a wide range of content. But what is the actual data on the app that we would be concerned about a foreign government having access to, and what would be the concern there?
Yeah, I think there's two basic ideas, and I think you're right that narrowing it to what data is being collected on American TikTok users is probably the most legitimate of the bevy of concerns that are floating around in the discussion space in this topic. So there's two basic issues we'd be worried about. One is that TikTok is collecting sensitive information about either government officials or important private actors that they can then use for intelligence purposes, blackmail or whatever, right? The other is the ability to use seemingly innocuous data to try to gather information. So and this went from potential to a real situation late last year when it was revealed that a Chinese team, and I don't know whether it was a CCP team or not, managed to use TikTok data in order to uncover who the anonymous sources were who were leaking information to the press. TikTok had been downloaded on both the journalists' devices and also the sources' devices. And by using the location data that the app was sending back to TikTok servers, they're able to figure out when those profiles crossed, and from that to identify who the sources were. So that's a sort of independently of getting specific information you can use against an individual, that's the other kind of sort of data mining that folks are concerned that the CCP may get access to if we continue to use TikTok the way we are.
So it seems like there's a constellation of concerns here. You have the national security dimension, which is what you just spoke to, spying, espionage, et cetera. In addition to mental health concerns that have been raised. You've heard this expression, TikTok brain. There's questions about the impact of predominantly young people who are spending hours scrolling through what's on TikTok, the threat of misinformation, questions about who controls, what content is showed to teenagers and young people, body images. It's just everything that kind of comes with, something such as TikTok. But what is the bulk of the argument? Because you sort of hear all these things. It seems like everyone has a problem with TikTok for one reason or another. But is there an argument that has more teeth than maybe some of the other arguments?
Yeah, I think the national security issues are the primary concerns. Right? The second that you hear most common that's TikTok specific is the ability to somehow manipulate the algorithm in order to push CCP propaganda or something like that. That I think is maybe or may not be a serious problem, but if it is, it's protected by the First Amendment. And it's not really clear to me that if we take that, even if we take that concern seriously, it's something that the government should do something about. The solution to that is better education, right? The solution to bad speech is more speech. Right. Independently of those sort of TikTok-specific issues, there's also a whole host of what you might call social media in general concerns that folks are worried about, right? Things like addiction to screen time, algorithmic amplification of bad content, things like that. Those are not, I think, TikTok-specific. And so I think using the TikTok debate to address those doesn't solve that problem. I think it's really important in this debate to set aside what are the things that we're worried about TikTok in particular, rather than what are the things we're worried about social media in general, because those can only be addressed by more generic legislation.
Sure. So just following up on that point exactly, big tech is sort of persona non grata in Washington these days, but why is TikTok in particular facing such a ferocious assault, whereas Instagram, Facebook, these other platforms who are no doubt in the business of surveillance capitalism and maybe doing some of the same things are not facing the same make or break moment that TikTok seems to be right now?
I'm not sure that's 100% true. I think most social media CEOs have been on the hot seat over the last few years. I think the jury's still out about exactly where either Congress or more likely the Federal Trade Commission is going to go in the attack on big tech. But I think you're right that there's more of a bipartisan support for taking adverse action against TikTok than these other platforms. Part of it, I think, is a generational divide, right? There's a sense that TikTok has grown enormously fast and among an enormously young user base. And I'm not sure that the policymakers appreciate that TikTok is actually as important to Gen Z as Twitter and Facebook were to Gen X and millennial counterparts, right? Sure. So I think the policymakers are underestimating the political price they might pay for what they may do to TikTok, which I think was one of the things that was reining them in from taking stronger action against American platforms. And I think part of it's just jingoism, right? Yeah.
So in other words, TikTok goes away. It sounds like there's a fear of some backlash on there on the part of its supporters, its young users, perhaps.
I think that TikTok's certainly banking on it, right? They had influencers running the halls of Congress during the hearing a week and a half ago, with the hope of trying to influence younger voters. I think that the folks in the room don't appreciate that. People who are using TikTok really like it, and that making it go away is going to be a serious problem.
Yeah, so to follow up on that, this potential TikTok ban, I want to ask you about actual congressional power and could they actually do this? We have the Restrict Act, which has been proposed, the Data Act, which has been proposed, but what would the legal complications be, the legal arguments that this wouldn't be constitutional and Congress doesn't have the power to actually do this?
Yeah, the biggest challenge I think is a First Amendment issue, right? A decision to ban TikTok nationwide, I think probably violates the First Amendment. And the reason I say that is because a TikTok ban is probably content neutral. But it still is suppressing a whole lot of speech, right? Every user who wants to use TikTok is now being told they can't use TikTok as a platform for what they want to do. So in order to pass judicial review, the government would have to show that the nationwide TikTok ban is furthering an important government interest unrelated to speech and is not suppressing significantly more speech than necessary to accomplish that interest. I think it's not a perfect analogy, but the closest analogy we've seen to this is the Packingham case, Packingham v. North Carolina, where North Carolina attached as a condition of sex offenders post-release restrictions that they couldn't use any social media apps. The concern was they might use the social media in order to try to entice minors and engage to put minors at risk. And the court recognized that protecting minors is an important governmental interest, but nonetheless said a complete ban on using all social media platforms, right, chills far more speech than necessary to accomplish that interest. And I think the same logic holds true in this case. Even if we think the concern about collecting information and serving as an intelligence source for the CCP is legitimate, and the government would have to prove that, which I think is really hard to do without revealing a whole lot of confidential information. But even if they can improve that, and even we spot the government that, a complete ban chills way more speech than necessary. There's a whole lot of stuff on TikTok that has zero intelligence value whatsoever, right? Dance videos and sea shanties and courtroom dramas. Like, all that would go away. And I think, so a complete ban is not narrowly tailored. There are other ways you can get at that concern, and I think a court will pretty easily recognize, because there's other ways to get at the national security interest at issue, a complete ban is unnecessary and therefore unconstitutional.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that quickly, just before moving on to the next question, as you alluded to at the onset, this does sort of emerge from the Trump era, a period of time where there's been a trade war with China. I think the Chinese government has no issue banning Western apps, Western social media platforms, Western goods. And being in a trade war, I know you sort of get into more complicated issues. Is there any role in the argument for the fact that it's perhaps a tit for tat? You're banning our platforms, we're banning yours. Does that overcome First Amendment issues? Is it seen as just another thing that we're banning, or is that a high bar to overcome if Congress seeks to try to get rid of TikTok?
Also, trade is part of our foreign policy, right? And foreign affairs is one of those places where the president's power is at its peak, particularly if Congress is backing, right? The old Youngstown paradigm. That having been said, they can't take any action that's going to otherwise violate the Constitution, right? The fact that there's a foreign affairs issue at stake doesn't remove the protections that the First Amendment would otherwise give. So no, I don't think that the fact that it's part and parcel of a trade war, or even if it was part and parcel of a real war, right, would necessarily eviscerate an otherwise pretty clear-cut First Amendment case.
Sure. Next question. So, you talked about the case that really poured fuel on the fire when it was discovered that the Chinese government was, using TikTok to try to find some leakers and, spy on some journalists. Does the U.S. need evidence to build a case that China and the Chinese military or the Chinese security state is in fact using TikTok for these purposes? In other words, evidence that this is going on, building the case that, this is in fact what the Chinese government is doing, more so than just the accusation or the threat that this is something that China could use. In other words, what kind of case, what kind of evidence do you need to build to pass muster in trying to get this done?
So I think in order to meet that sort of first prong of the First Amendment analysis, they'd have to show that the important government interest is not merely conjectural. That having been said, I don't think it needs to be sort of a open and shut case either, right? Particularly where national security and intelligence sources are at stake, right? The government has the option of giving evidence in camera, for example, which would allow the judge to decide without all the information being made public. And I'm not an expert on all of those nuances of how national security intersects with this area of the law, but I think making up a story about how it might be an intelligence source is probably insufficient to overcome the First Amendment. There have to be some sort of proof.
And what would an actual TikTok ban look like, almost like mechanically? And are there concerns that it can be done like cleanly and completely without there still being some way for like the Chinese government or the former Chinese company to have access to that data?
Well, so most of the proposals are focused on the company itself, saying the company can't offer service to Americans or can't do business in America, as opposed to regulating Americans, saying Americans can't download TikTok, right? I think the cleanest way to try to accomplish a ban would be to prevent the app from being made available in the various app stores. It's not a complete solution, right? Because you can still sideload on Android and you can sideload on Apple too, as long as you don't mind violating the terms of service. But it's not clear how easy it is to get 100% compliance with a ban, right? A ban would have a significant amount of effect, but would never get to zero. If we had the ability to reduce crime on the internet to zero, right, piracy would not be a real thing.
And do you think there'd be repercussions for other, Chinese-made apps in the U.S.? Do you think that if TikTok were to be banned, like there would be the next thing that they would want to ban, or do you think it could be just like a one and done thing specific to TikTok?
Technically, right, group liability is not the sort of thing that the judicial system usually endorses. So a ban on TikTok, I think, would be focused on the ByteDance company, TikTok's parent corporation, and regulate them, but not otherwise.
Just following up on your previous answer there about how this would be accomplished, just from a statutory construction standpoint, trying to understand what levers Congress would turn to try to actually effectuate this. Is it a bill that's passed? Is it an order telling Apple and Google to take this out of your app stores? How do you do that in a way that maybe doesn't create takings problems? Like, what are the actual levers that would be pulled?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not familiar with the nuances of all the bills that are under consideration, but I think most of them are directed at ByteDance.
Okay.
I actually think. I also think most of them are primarily signaling bills,
Okay.
right? Like Josh Hawley's banned TikTok bill, I don't know that it's really intended to be adopted. It's more intended to raise the question.
Okay.
If you want to talk about like legislation that stands a good chance of surviving judicial review, something more narrow than a nationwide ban, the most likely path is through the CFIUS, the CFIUS. Protocols, which is where TikTok has been for the last 3 or 4 years. CFIUS has authority to regulate what goods and services can come into the United States and on what conditions. And so placing conditions that survive constitutional muster on ByteDance as a condition of continuing to allow TikTok on American shores would be the way to go.
We've talked at a few points here about how this is a strikingly bipartisan issue in an era where very little seems to be bipartisan. How has this become so bipartisan?
It's a good question. I think there is a little bit of sort of COVID hangover. I don't want to sort of jump to the arguments that some TikTok proponents are making. This is all just kind of xenophobia, because I don't think that's completely accurate. But I do think there's some concern that post-COVID we've seen that the relationship between China and the United States is unique and significant, and China has places where they can exert leverage against us, either consciously or unintentionally, right? And so there's a concern that the more information we funnel back to the CCP, the more they may be able to use it against us in order to cause additional pain points. And so I think the national security implications are the thing that's driving why there's such a bipartisan consensus on TikTok in particular. But we are seeing more of a bipartisan consensus, at least at the 10,000-foot level, on the need to regulate social media more generally.
Right.
And so it kind of flows out of that as well.
Sure. So, looking at the different proposals, and you alluded to one of them, some of them are predominantly from GOP lawmakers, they specifically target TikTok, and they don't have as much support from Democrats. You have the Restrict Act, they're restricting the emergence of security threats that risk information and communicate. You know how these acronyms tend to go.
Sure.
Which is a bipartisan bill. It's more likely to pass. You talked about CFIUS. There's a variety of approaches that are out there, and then you also have this issue of, well, wait a minute. It seems like Facebook and Twitter, they're kind of doing some of the same things, except maybe they're showing you advertisements for, collecting information for maybe more benign purposes than TikTok is alleged to be able to do. So it sounds like this CFIUS route might hold water. Like, is there a sense for if this were to work, like which way of dealing with this has a higher chance of actually happening?
So something like the CFIUS route, or some legislation that's going in the same direction that CFIUS is going, the White House is sort of thinking along those lines, nudging Congress in that direction, is probably the most likely. If we see some development in this area, I think that's most likely. And it would be some combination of ownership limitations, right? Making sure that TikTok is being managed not by ByteDance, but by a company that doesn't have clear connections with the Chinese Communist Party, or data offshoring restrictions, right? Making sure that the data that's being collected on American users is kept in the United States and subject to very strict data transfer protocols. The latter is certainly where TikTok is going.
Yeah.
That's what they would like, and what they've offered at CFIUS.
Sure. Last question I wanted to ask. Some commentators look at this and say that beneath the surface here, you have American tech companies, so Google's, YouTube, Instagram, all the rest, who've tried very intensely in the last few years, but have been unable to replicate TikTok's success in the sort of short, mass viral video format. YouTube has shorts, there's reels, there's story. Other companies have tried to replicate the exponential growth of TikTok, but no one's really been able to do it from a competitive standpoint. And of course, if TikTok were banned, you have U.S. tech companies that seek to fill the void and would certainly profit from that. They're some of the largest lobbyists in Washington. Do you think those politics are at play here? You've had with the whole Section 230 debate, what do we do with the tech companies? Some people point out how many children of people in Congress work for tech companies. Some of these bills seem to just die on the floor. Do you think that the American tech companies, that lobby is playing some kind of a role here?
there is certainly an undercurrent that what we're really seeing is industrial policy with thin foreign policy veneer, right? And it's not the first time that's come up. This was also an issue 5 or 6 years ago when Huawei equipment was banned from American networks, right? And so the American government required telecom companies to go and rip out all the Huawei equipment and to pressure our allies to do the same. And it was never really made public how much of the Huawei concern was legitimate rather than how much was concern that Huawei was just beating American manufacturers in the marketplace.
So, in other words, it was more legitimate than the competitive piece, or the other way around?
So I would say both concerns were on the table. And although the Huawei rip and replace stuff got done, and it got done under a national security rationale, it was never really clear how much of this was just in effect to undo the results of market competition.
Okay.
There's certainly a number of analysts who think that's the case. I haven't taken a position on that because I haven't looked at the data either way, and I'm not sure I could get the data, but it's certainly whispers.
Okay.
I think you could tell a story in which the TikTok ban is something similar. The reason why I don't think that's the predominant force in this situation is that A, those competitors who would benefit are themselves in the crosshairs politically, right? And B, you have a very strong national security story to tell here about the role of data privacy and data information and what it can be used for in order to advance a geopolitical foe's intelligence purposes.
Sure. Very interesting stuff. Well, this has been BC Law's Just Law Podcast. I'm Tom Blake with Jim Fiore. I've been talking to Professor Daniel Lyons about the TikTok ban and everything that's going on with that in Washington. Professor Lyons, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Until next time, that'll do for this one. Thanks for tuning in.